Good morning, everyone. It's Reverend Donna. The sermon title this morning is Do You Love Me? For the past few Sundays since Easter, we've been studying the various post-resurrection appearances that Jesus made to his disciples, all attesting to the fact that he had indeed been raised. Today's readings are not resurrection stories per se, because their focus is not really on his resurrection and ascension, but rather moves beyond the resurrection to the future of believers. It is thought that John, Jesus' beloved disciple, wrote this gospel in about 90 AD, the latest of the Gospels, in the time of the first century church who were being persecuted. 1/5 of John's Gospel, chapters 13 to 17, is devoted to Jesus' words about the future community of believers after Jesus' ascension. The abundant catch of fish and the providing of food on the beach suggests that Jesus' gifts will continue beyond his death and resurrection, and in spite of denial and desertion. This is good news indeed. Chapter 21 takes place after the disciples have seen the risen Jesus on several occasions, and Peter says, "I'm going fishing." I would imagine that the disciples were pretty confused about all that they had witnessed, and maybe needed a little time to figure it all out. Maybe because fishing was their profession before Jesus came along, it was something familiar and routine. Maybe they were considering going back to fishing now that Jesus was gone. Or maybe their families had gotten after them. "Come down to earth, you've had your big adventure, now it's time to be responsible and bring in some money." So why, as professional fishermen, after fishing all night, didn't they catch anything? God obviously had other plans. This was reminiscent of another night in Luke 5, verses 4 to 7, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when he called out to them and told them to drop their nets on the other side of the boat, and they hauled in a huge catch. Then he called to them to follow him, and he would make them fishers of men. So now it dawned on them. The stranger on the beach was Jesus. Peter, true to character, throws on clothes and jumps into the water to go to Jesus, even though the boat was only about 100 yards out, and leaves the disciples with the work. When they went ashore, they saw Jesus and the charcoal fire with fish on it and bread. I've always wondered where Jesus got the fish and the bread that was already cooking. Anyways, he tells them to bring some of the fish they have just caught, and it specifies 153 of them were caught. Why this detail? Well, it certainly shows a first-hand account of a witness. And Jesus proceeds to cook them breakfast. In preparing this meal for the disciples, Jesus has once more taken on the role of a servant, a gracious host. It says none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Well, how did they not recognize him after being with him for 3 years? He was different somehow. They knew it was him through symbolic actions, the voice. But the resurrection body was different. Somehow he had passed through death into a strange new world. Jesus is providing for the disciples in this miraculous gift of fish, and feeding them breakfast was another sign reminding them of the feeding of the 5,000 with loaves and fishes and the Last Supper. Maybe the point is that the risen Christ will continue to provide for the future disciples.